scale of Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 election is coming into fuller focus. Breaking over the weekend, Trump is projected to be the winner in Arizona, completing a complete sweep of all 7 battleground states. Combine that with control of the Senate, Republicans are projected to hold at least 52 seats and quite possibly control of the House, which has not been called yet, but Republicans are currently just 5 seats short of a majority there. Donald Trump is now likely to return to Washington with a trifecta, to say nothing of the 6-3 conservative majority in the third branch of government. We are, of course, talking about the Supreme Court, giving Trump a potentially unprecedented grip on all the levers of political power, all of which makes one of his first announcements as president-elect puzzling. Trump is demanding that whoever takes the reins of the GOP caucus in the Senate agree to allow recess appointments to his cabinet. In other words, to allow Donald Trump to bypass Senate confirmation, again, a Senate controlled by Republicans, of all of his picks. That's despite the fact that Trump likely has a commanding majority for approval of any of his nominations. Now, on the topic of recess appointments, CNN reports this, quote, recess appointments were once controversial, last-ditch efforts for presidents to install their nominees after facing long confirmation odds in the Senate. President George W. Bush appointed John Bolton as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations via a recess appointment, for example, as it was unlikely he would have made it through the Senate. President Obama's attempt to use recess appointment power wound up at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against President Obama and in favor of the GOP-led Senate. They said Obama's appointments were unconstitutional. Just begs a question this morning, right? Why would such a strong, powerful president demand the use of such a weak tool used by weak presidents? As for the 3 contenders to be the Senate Majority Leader, one, Rick Scott, outright endorsed the idea of allowing Trump to bypass the powers of their own chamber. In doing so, he earned the support of Trump ally Elon Musk in his own race. The competition, the other 2 guys, John Thune and John Cornyn, refused to rule out letting a president of their own party skip them and their body and use recess appointments instead. So the question is, why does Trump want to use recess appointments? And what kind of cabinet is he assembling that he doesn't think he can get his picks through the Republican-controlled Senate? It's a question that looms over all of Washington today. As names are floated and his administration starts to take shape, Trump announced this morning that Tom Homan, his former acting director of ICE, will be a border czar. Washington Post reports this: a border czar role does not require Senate confirmation. Homan stepped down from the administration in frustration when the White House failed to move his nomination to be ICE director towards Senate confirmation. He became a Fox News analyst on immigration and border issues instead. J.D. Vance today confirmed a CNN report that another immigration hardliner, Stephen Miller, will be returning to the White House as Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. Trump's demand in the wake of his massive victory for unchecked power as he fills out his administration, and why he's doing it this way is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Out west, where Trump is, in West Palm Beach, NBC News correspondent Von Hillier joins us. Also joining us, MSNBC columnist and contributor Charlie Sykes is here, and former Democratic Senator, MSNBC political analyst Claire McCaskill is here. Claire, first, just add anything I may have left out about why presidents use recess appointments. I mean, the history I offered was one that I was around for. George W. Bush was in probably the weakest standing of his presidency, and John Bolton was not a popular pick even in his own party, so it was a way to get someone there for a shorter period of time. Why would Trump, after such a commanding victory, use a tool most closely associated with weakness in the president making these picks?
You got me. I can't figure it out unless. I mean, it's very weird that his opening salvo would be, I'm going to pick people that are so bad my own party won't support them, which is essentially what he's saying. He's going to have a minimum of 52 senators. Maybe he's going to pick such crazy people he thinks he can't get Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins and maybe one or two others. Maybe he wants to go so outside the norm that he doesn't think the Constitution should apply to him. But the Supreme Court has spoken on this. Recess appointments are stopgap for limited periods of time. If he has some idea, he can just blow up the Constitution over the role of confirmation and advise and consent. He is not talking to real lawyers, which, of course, he has a habit of doing.
Von Hilliard, what is your understanding of why Trump, with this commanding victory on Tuesday, there's no way to describe it as anything less than that, is using a tool, again, often turned to by presidents in weak political standing?
Let's be very clear structurally. There are still some senators that voted to convict him in the aftermath of the January 6th attack. People like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, Bill Cassidy, they're still in the U.S. Senate. And in the scenario that you add on another senator or two who are resistant to some of the picks who he believes are the best positioned to implement the policy that he wants to enact in these department and agencies, then it would be beneficial for him, in order to enact the policies he wants to enact, to bypass the confirmation process. In this, by guaranteeing that he has a Senate Majority Leader who, if he desires and wants to go that route, is willing to and ensures, while this is still an open process between the likes of a John Thune and a John Cornyn and a Rick Scott, well, it's going to be advantageous for him power-wise to make sure that he gets somebody in that Senate Majority Leader position who is not an inhibitor to his ability to go and use Washington in the 4 years that he has to his advantage. And that, I think, is why when you're hearing individuals like Kash Patel, who met resistance among some, let's be very clear, conservatives from Donald Trump's first administration, to after 4 years, Donald Trump, as he has eyed how he would make a second administration look, if he wants to get people like Kash Patel in these positions here, it would be advantageous for him to find whatever path that it would take to be able to do that.
Charlie Sykes, Von's reporting is always 100% correct, but it requires us to pull another layer off the onion. I mean, Trump won the popular vote. Trump has a mandate to do whatever he wants. Trump just has to be 1 inch shy of his worst impulses, and he soars into Washington really with a mandate. I mean, I think it reveals a deeper phenomena, I think, that one, he still doesn't really understand power in Washington to turn to this weak leader tool. That's what the recess appointment is. It is, again, and I've worked for people who've had to use it, but only when their approval ratings were at the low point of Bush's presidency. It was after re-election. He was the lame duck, and he was struggling to get his appointees through. That's when he used it. Again, President Obama, at a point where he couldn't get people through any other way. I mean, it is not a tool used in a position of strength. What does it say to you that this is how he wants to bring his first batch of cabinet members into Washington?
Well, three things. First of all, I mean, this is his first shot across the bow of any idea of checks and balances. Number two, he is demanding absolute loyalty from the U.S. Senate, as opposed to thinking of Congress as a co-equal branch of government. You know, he is basically saying, look, here's my loyalty test. I want you to take a knee for me even before I take office. And of course, Rick Scott was the first guy to actually assume that position. And then number three, what you've been discussing is that, you know, despite his victory, he apparently would like to install people in the cabinet who are perhaps too extreme even for the Republican Party. I mean, I think the default position that we ought to have here, Nicole, is that the Republican Party will always disappoint us and will always cave in. But having said that, he obviously has some concerns about what would happen if he appointed Rick Grenell to a top position, or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as, you know, to his cabinet as some sort of a health, you know, not a health czar, but, you know, HHS. So he obviously is thinking that there are some people who are too toxic even for a Republican majority. But I do think the most interesting thing here is how will the Senate Republicans react to this? Because the power of advice and consent is one of the Constitution's most important functions, to say that This is one of the key powers of the U.S. Senate. They are not just potted plants. They do not work for the president. For the Republican Senate to come in and preemptively surrender would be a stunning dereliction of duty, but also just an indication that they no longer take their co-equal branch of government position seriously. So I think that Donald Trump is basically saying, I want to have unitary control over all government. He's demanding absolute loyalty, and he's signaling that he is going to make appointments that will be too toxic to get through a 53 vote Republican majority Senate.
I'm never in disagreement with you, Charlie Sykes, but I mean, I think that's offensive to potted plants. This is a Senate Republican, and we should say their names. This is a group of men and women. Mitch McConnell didn't have the courage to vote for Trump's impeachment, but he referred him to Merrick Garland to deal with. I mean, there is nothing that they won't go along with. They just proved that to us.
That's right.